In the depths of the human soul sometimes lurk abysses that surpass even the darkest shadows of night. Tommy Lynn Sells was such an abyss in human form, a predator who roamed across the United States, leaving behind a bloody trail that would shake the nation. Since this serial killer primarily victimized women and children, and since this episode, like the others about Tommy Lynn Sells, contains details of these crimes, you might prefer not to listen if you find such matters difficult to handle. It was the 5th of September 1999 when Sells's dark journey led him to Cape Girardeau, Missouri. There, he took a job with R.B. Potasnik, a company looking for men to build the two-lane State Road 84 in Florida. This road, affectionately called Alligator Alley by locals, would later become Interstate 75, a straight highway stretching through the wild solitude of the Everglades from the Atlantic coast to the Gulf Coast. While Sells was working in the swamps of Florida, he received news of his father, William Sells's death. But his father's death passed over him like a distant breeze. On one fateful day, Sells stood hip-deep in murky water, a measuring rod in hand, when suddenly a snake swam past his legs. In that moment, as cold fear crawled up his spine, he knew it was time to go. He returned to St. Louis, where the law was already waiting for him. On January 13th, he was arrested again for car theft, another entry in his steadily growing record. In September 1988, Sells moved further north. That month, 11-year-old Melissa Ann Tremblay disappeared in Salem, New Hampshire. She was last seen in a supermarket parking lot, talking to a dark-haired man who needed a shave, and was sitting in the front seat of a rusty light brown delivery van. On September 12th, her body was found face down on the tracks between two trains in a Boston and Maine freight yard in Lawrence, Massachusetts. She had been sexually assaulted before being stabbed. Footprints and blood, 20 meters from where her body was found, indicated she had fought with her attacker. As a cruel irony of fate, her body was run over by a freight train slowly entering the yard, further desecrating the site of her death. In the fall of that same year, Sells entered the life of a woman with a 3-year-old son in Salt Lake City, Utah. With perfidious skill, he taught the little boy to make sad faces and heart-wrenching little smiles while holding up a sign next to them that read, "Homeless and hungry. Please help." After several weeks of begging, he lured them on a trip. They got into a stolen black Dodge van and drove to Idaho to spend the night by the majestic Snake River in Gooding County. Mother and son never returned from this fateful journey. Sells later confessed that he had killed both and thrown their bodies into the river. He left the scene of horror, his pockets still filled with cash collected from compassionate passers-by. The warmth of Tucson drew Tommy Lynn Sells further south in mid-December. There, his path crossed with another homeless man, Kent Allen Lawton from Phoenix. What began as a harmless drug deal ended in a deadly confrontation. Sells, offended by Lawton's mockery and refusal to pay, waited for nightfall. Under cover of darkness, he crept up on his unsuspecting victim and stabbed repeatedly with a pocket knife until Kent bled out. Lonely and abandoned like a stray dog. With bare hands, Sells dug a shallow grave, rolled the body in, and barely covered it with dirt, dead leaves, and trash. He vanished into the night as if nothing had happened. 2 days later, on December 18th, a 12-year-old boy searching for sand for his grandfather discovered the grisly truth: a human hand protruding eerily from the ground. By this time, Tommy Lynn Sells was already in San Bernardino, California, fleeing from his latest misdeed. On Christmas Eve, Sells was arrested for assault with a deadly weapon. However, the victim could not be found, and authorities were forced to reluctantly release him. He drove northward on Interstate 5 and next stopped in Berkeley. On January 27, 1989, he got into an argument with a ticket seller at a BART station, which documented his presence in the area. Sells later claimed he was responsible for the death of a 20-year-old prostitute while he was there. According to his account, it was a drug deal gone wrong. He had originally believed he was dealing with a man, but learned her true gender shortly before killing her. Around this time, police found an unidentified body where he claimed to have left it, north of Lake Tahoe, in a town called Truckee. In March, Sells made a detour to Colorado and then continued north on Route 5 until he reached Roseburg, Oregon, a small town on the highway an hour south of Eugene. He worked for a small logging operation and lived in the house of a local couple. During his stay in the area, Sells claimed he had kidnapped, raped, and killed a long-haired young woman in her 20s. On May 9th, he met a hitchhiker who wanted to ride with him to Washington State. But when she tried to steal his dope, he murdered her too. He left both bodies in the woods where he was cutting trees. Later that same day, he was arrested for second-degree theft for stealing $30 from a firewood stand's cash register. After 15 days in the Roseburg jail, Tommy Lynn Sells was a free man again. He made a brief stop in Berkeley before heading east to Arkansas. On August 16, 1989, he was charged with receiving stolen property and arrested in North Little Rock. On the 23rd of the same month, the charges were dropped, and Sells was free again. He briefly returned to Oakland and then made a detour to Montana for a short visit with a girlfriend in Missoula. Then it was back to Oakland, just in time to experience the devastating earthquake of October 17th. Just before the earth began to shake, Sells got off a commuter train and went to the bathroom to inject heroin. He was standing in front of the facility, pressing a small bottle of night train to his lips, when the tremors began and the lights went out. In panic, he clung to a light pole while buildings collapsed and streets broke apart around him. Sells didn't wait for the aftershocks. He raced south to Reno, where he was arrested the following night and taken to a detox center. But like so many times before, this rehabilitation was futile. He was arrested again in Carson City, Nevada, and placed in a rehabilitation center for another 30 days. In December of that same year, he overdosed on heroin and was admitted to a hospital in Phoenix for 48 hours. In January 1990, Sells returned to Salt Lake City. On January 7th, he was arrested for cocaine possession and car theft. When the crime lab results showed the substance wasn't cocaine, he was released. He went to Wyoming, where his criminal activities earned him a longer prison stay. In Rawlins, Wyoming, Sells struck up a conversation with a young couple on January 12, 1990, both about 18 years old. The woman was heavily pregnant, and their truck's tires were worn out. Sells offered to help them with their transportation problem, a seemingly harmless gesture that would soon prove to be a fatal mistake. He prowled around the area until he found a 1978 Dodge four-wheel drive pickup with the right tires. Then he stole it. Bobby Daniels, the owner, tried unsuccessfully to chase him down. Sells removed the tires from the stolen pickup and put them on the desperate couple's truck. With a travel bag from inside the stolen vehicle, he set out to find alternative transportation. 3 days later, on January 15th, he was arrested at the local Greyhound bus station. This time, he wouldn't escape so easily. On April 25, 1990, he was sentenced to 2 to 5 years in the Wyoming State Penitentiary for car theft and possession of stolen property. Prison life seemed to agree with Sells. He kept himself busy in the prison garage, where he completed a course in auto mechanics. Soon, he was known as one of the best mechanics in the facility. He spent his free time reading books from the prison library, particularly favoring murder mysteries and true crime stories. Behind bars, Tommy Lynn Sells discovered religion, or at least pretended to. He joined a prison Bible study group and attended services regularly. He even managed to convince the prison chaplain of his sincere desire for redemption. His good behavior and apparent rehabilitation earned him an early release. On September 27, 1991, after serving only 18 months of his sentence, Sells walked out of prison a free man. His parole officer arranged a job for him at a truck stop in Cheyenne. But Tommy Lynn Sells hadn't changed. The darkness within him had merely been dormant, waiting for its chance to resurface. Within days of his release, he violated his parole by leaving Wyoming. He headed south to Texas, where his sister lived. By early October, he was in Austin, Texas, where he met Margie Peterson, a woman in her mid-30s who would play an important role in his future. She was a single mother with 3 children, struggling to make ends meet while working as a waitress and secretary. At first glance, she seemed an unlikely match for Sells. She was deeply religious and didn't drink or use drugs. Despite their differences, or perhaps because of them, they began a relationship. Sells moved in with her and her children, and for a while he seemed to be trying to live a normal life. He found work as a mechanic and attended church with Margie and her children. But the facade of normalcy couldn't last. By December, Sells had disappeared, leaving Margie with unpaid bills and broken promises. He surfaced briefly in Missouri, where he was arrested for stealing a car in St. Louis on December 18th. He spent Christmas in jail before being released on bond. The new year found him back in Texas. On January 7, 1992, he was arrested in Houston for possession of a controlled substance. The charges were later dropped due to lack of evidence. For the next few months, Sells drifted between Texas and Missouri, leaving a trail of petty crimes and drug-related offenses. In April, he returned to Margie Peterson in Austin. She took him back, hoping he had changed. Their reconciliation didn't last long. By May, Sells was gone again, this time heading to St. Louis. There, he found work at a carnival, setting up and taking down rides. The carnival lifestyle suited him perfectly. Constant travel, temporary relationships, and plenty of opportunities for theft and drug use. During this period, Sells claimed to have committed several murders, though many remain unverified. He described killing a hitchhiker in California, a homeless man in Nevada, and a prostitute in Missouri. The details he provided were vague, and no bodies were ever found to confirm these claims. In July 1992, Sells returned once again to Margie Peterson in Austin. This time she insisted he get help for his drug addiction. She convinced him to enter a rehabilitation program at a local church-run facility. For 6 weeks, he attended meetings and counseling sessions. But on August 23rd, everything changed. While high on drugs, Sells got into an argument with one of Margie's neighbors. The confrontation turned violent, and Sells stabbed the man repeatedly. The neighbor survived, but Sells fled before police arrived. He made his way to Little Rock, Arkansas, where he was arrested on September 1st for public intoxication. After his release, he headed west, eventually ending up in California again. In San Diego, Sells found work at another carnival. The constant movement and temporary nature of carnival work made it easy for him to stay ahead of the law. He traveled up and down the West Coast, working various carnival circuits, usually setting up and dismantling rides. During this period, his drug use escalated. He was using heroin daily, supplementing his carnival wages with theft and small-time drug dealing. He later claimed to have committed several murders during this time, though like many of his confessions, these remained unverified. In April 1993, Sells made his way back to St. Louis. There, he reconnected with some carnival workers he had known previously. They offered him work with a traveling carnival that was heading east through Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. While working this carnival circuit, Sells met Keith Dardeen, a 32-year-old factory worker from Ina, Illinois. Dardeen had brought his pregnant wife and 3-year-old son to the carnival, and they struck up a conversation with Sells. This chance meeting would have tragic consequences. On November 18, 1993, Sells entered the Dardeen family's mobile home. What followed was one of his most brutal crimes. He murdered Keith Dardeen, his pregnant wife, and their young son. The violence of this attack shocked even hardened investigators. After the Dardeen murders, Sells fled Illinois. He made his way to Missouri, then west to California, working carnivals along the way. His drug use continued unabated, and he supported his habit through theft and occasional drug dealing. In early 1994, he found himself back in St. Louis. There, he met Fabienne Witherspoon, a 28-year-old single mother. Despite his disheveled appearance and obvious drug problems, she took pity on him and offered him a place to stay. On April 8, 1994, Sells attacked Witherspoon in her apartment. He attempted to rape and kill her, but she fought back fiercely. In the struggle, she managed to escape and call for help. Sells fled before police arrived, but this time they had a name and description. The attack on Witherspoon marked a turning point. For the first time, there was a surviving victim who could identify Sells and testify against him. However, he managed to stay one step ahead of law enforcement, constantly moving between states. He made his way to Tennessee, where he found work with yet another carnival. The carnival circuit took him through Kentucky, West Virginia, and eventually back to Missouri. All the while, he continued his pattern of drug use, theft, and violence. By late 1994, Sells had made his way to Texas again. He spent time in various cities, including Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio, working odd jobs and continuing his drug use. In December, he met Julie Estes, a 30-year-old woman with 2 young children. Julie was immediately drawn to Sells, despite, or perhaps because of, his troubled past. She saw him as someone she could help, someone she could save. Within weeks, he had moved in with her and her children in their small apartment in Houston. For a few months, Sells seemed to be trying to turn his life around. He found work as a mechanic and attempted to stay clean. He attended church with Julie and her children and even talked about marriage. But as before, the stability didn't last. In March 1995, after a violent argument with Julie, Sells disappeared. He took her car and what little money she had saved. She reported the car stolen, but by then, Sells was long gone, heading west toward California. The next few months saw Sells moving between Texas, California, and Missouri, always staying one step ahead of the law. He worked carnivals when he could find them, took odd jobs when he couldn't, and continued his pattern of drug use and petty crime. In October 1995, Sells arrived in Salt Lake City, Utah. He found work with another traveling carnival, setting up rides and working concession stands. The carnival was scheduled to work its way south through Utah and Arizona before heading to Texas for the winter. While in Salt Lake City, Sells met Stephanie Stroh, a 23-year-old woman who worked at a local diner. She was immediately attracted to his mysterious nature and rough charm. Despite warnings from friends and family, she began spending time with him. On November 3rd, Stephanie disappeared. Her body was never found, but years later, Sells would confess to her murder. He claimed to have strangled her and disposed of her body in the desert outside the city. Like many of his confessions, the details were difficult to verify. After Stephanie's disappearance, Sells continued south with the carnival. By December, he was in Phoenix, Arizona. There he met Jessica Martinez, a 20-year-old single mother working as a waitress. She allowed him to move in with her and her young son. The relationship was volatile from the start. Both were heavy drug users, and their arguments frequently turned violent. On New Year's Eve 1995, after a particularly brutal fight, Sells disappeared again, taking Jessica's car and savings. The first months of 1996 saw Sells moving through Texas, working at various carnivals and temporary jobs. His drug use had escalated to the point where he was using heroin daily, funding his habit through theft and small-time drug dealing. In March, he arrived in San Antonio, where he met Crystal Surlees, a 28-year-old mother of 3. Despite his obvious drug problems, she allowed him to move in with her and her children. The relationship was tumultuous from the start. On April 12th, after a violent argument, Sells attacked Crystal with a knife. She survived but was severely injured. Once again, Sells fled before police arrived. This time, however, Crystal was able to provide authorities with detailed information about him. The attack on Crystal Surlees led to increased police attention. For the first time, law enforcement began to connect various incidents and attacks across multiple states. However, Sells managed to stay ahead of them by constantly moving and changing his appearance. He made his way to Tennessee, where he found work with yet another carnival. The carnival circuit took him through Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois. Throughout this period, he continued his pattern of drug use and violence. By late 1996, Sells had made his way back to Missouri. In St. Louis, he reconnected with some carnival workers he had known previously. They offered him work with a traveling carnival that was heading south through Arkansas and Texas. During this period, Sells later claimed to have committed several murders, though many of these claims remained unverified. His drug use had reached new heights, and he was spending nearly all his money on heroin and methamphetamine. In December 1996, while the carnival was in Dallas, Sells met Mary Beatrice, a 30-year-old single mother. Despite his obvious drug problems and unstable behavior, she allowed him to move in with her and her young daughter. The relationship followed a familiar pattern. At first, Sells appeared to be trying to improve his life. He found temporary work and attempted to stay clean. But within weeks, the drug use and violence resumed. On January 8, 1997, after a violent confrontation, Mary asked Sells to leave. He responded by attacking her with a knife. She survived but was severely injured. Once again, Sells fled before police arrived, taking Mary's car and whatever money he could find. The first half of 1997 saw Sells moving between Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. He continued working with traveling carnivals when possible, taking odd jobs when necessary. His drug use remained severe, and he supported his habit through theft and occasional drug dealing. In July 1997, he arrived in Phoenix, Arizona. There, he met Sarah Kinslow, a 25-year-old woman working at a local diner. Despite his disheveled appearance and erratic behavior, she took pity on him and offered him a place to stay. The arrangement lasted only 2 weeks. After Sarah discovered Sells using drugs in her apartment, she asked him to leave. He responded violently, attacking her with a knife. She managed to escape and call the police, but Sells fled before they arrived. This attack led to increased police attention in Arizona. Local authorities began connecting various incidents and sharing information with law enforcement in other states. However, Sells managed to stay ahead of them by constantly moving. He made his way east through New Mexico and into Texas, working at various carnivals along the way. By fall of 1997, he was back in San Antonio, where he found work as a mechanic at a small auto repair shop. In San Antonio, Sells managed to maintain a period of relative stability. He worked regularly at the auto shop and even attempted to stay clean for brief periods. However, his drug use continued, and he frequently disappeared for days at a time. In November 1997, he met Jessica Thompson, a 32-year-old nurse and single mother. Despite warnings from friends about his behavior, she allowed him to move in with her and her 2 children. The relationship initially seemed promising. For several weeks, Sells appeared to be making an effort to change. He attended NA meetings with Jessica and talked about getting permanent work. However, by mid-December, he had relapsed into heavy drug use, and his behavior became increasingly erratic. On December 28, 1997, after discovering Sells using drugs in their home, Jessica asked him to leave. He became violent, attacking her in front of her children. She managed to escape with the children and call police, but Sells fled before they arrived. This incident marked another escalation in police interest. Law enforcement agencies in multiple states began sharing information about similar attacks and incidents. However, Sells remained elusive, constantly moving between states and changing his appearance. The beginning of 1998 found Sells moving through southern Texas. He had become increasingly paranoid, convinced that law enforcement was closing in on him. His drug use reached new extremes as he attempted to cope with his growing anxiety. In February, he arrived in Corpus Christi, where he found work at a carnival that was preparing for the spring season. The carnival circuit would take him through several Texas cities before heading north into Oklahoma. During this period, Sells later claimed to have committed multiple murders, though many of these claims remained unverified. His mental state had deteriorated significantly, and he was experiencing frequent episodes of drug-induced paranoia. In April 1998, while the carnival was in Oklahoma City, Sells met Linda Martinez, a 29-year-old single mother working at a convenience store. Despite his unstable behavior, she allowed him to stay with her and her young son. The relationship quickly turned violent. After just 2 weeks, Linda asked Sells to leave when she discovered him using drugs in her home. He attacked her, but fled when neighbors, hearing her screams, called the police. This incident led to another warrant for his arrest. Following the Oklahoma City incident, Sells headed west into New Mexico. His paranoia had intensified, and he began avoiding carnival work, believing it made him too easy to track. Instead, he took temporary construction jobs, rarely staying in one place for more than a few days. By June 1998, he had made his way to Arizona. In Phoenix, he met Rachel Conway, a 34-year-old waitress. Despite his obviously troubled state, she offered him a place to stay. The arrangement lasted less than a week before his violent behavior forced her to ask him to leave. When Rachel threatened to call the police, Sells attacked her with a knife. She survived but was seriously injured. This attack led to increased coordination between law enforcement agencies across multiple states, as the pattern of similar attacks became clear. Sells fled Arizona, heading east through New Mexico. His drug use had reached catastrophic levels, and he was experiencing frequent episodes of psychosis. He later claimed to have committed several murders during this period, though many of these claims could not be verified. By August 1998, he had returned to Texas, finding work with various traveling carnivals. His mental state continued to deteriorate as he moved between cities, supporting his drug habit through theft and occasional drug dealing. In September 1998, Sells arrived in Del Rio, Texas. His appearance had changed dramatically. He had lost significant weight and appeared much older than his 34 years. Despite his disheveled state, he managed to find work at a local auto repair shop. During this period, Sells met Maria Gonzalez, a 28-year-old single mother who worked at a nearby diner. Despite warnings from co-workers about his erratic behavior, she allowed him to move in with her and her daughter. The relationship followed the now familiar pattern. Initially, Sells appeared to be trying to improve his life, even attending church with Maria and her daughter. However, within weeks, his drug use and violent behavior resurfaced. On October 13, 1998, after discovering drug paraphernalia in their home, Maria confronted Sells and demanded he leave. He responded with violence, attacking both Maria and her daughter. Neighbors, hearing the commotion, called the police. This time, Sells barely escaped before law enforcement arrived. The attack marked a significant turning point. It was the first time he had attacked a child in front of witnesses. The incident led to increased media coverage and a more coordinated police effort to apprehend him. Following the Del Rio incident, Sells fled north, eventually crossing into Oklahoma. His mental state had deteriorated further, and he was experiencing frequent episodes of drug-induced psychosis. He avoided public places, sleeping in abandoned buildings, and stealing to support his drug habit. By December 1998, he had made his way to Kansas, where the onset of winter forced him to seek more stable shelter. In Wichita, he met Susan Parker, a 36-year-old nurse at a local shelter where she volunteered. Despite his obvious instability, she offered him temporary housing. The arrangement lasted only 10 days. After discovering Sells using drugs and becoming increasingly aggressive, Susan asked him to leave. He attacked her with a knife, but she managed to escape and contact police. Once again, Sells fled before law enforcement arrived. This attack led to renewed media attention and increased coordination between law enforcement agencies. Police departments in multiple states were now actively sharing information about similar attacks and confirmed sightings of Sells. By early 1999, Sells had returned to Texas, moving between small towns and continuing to work sporadically with traveling carnivals. His behavior had become increasingly erratic, and he was spending most of his money on drugs. In February 1999, Sells arrived in San Angelo, Texas. His physical and mental deterioration was evident. He appeared gaunt, aged, and was displaying clear signs of paranoid behavior. Despite his condition, he managed to find work at a local truck stop. During this period, he met Angela Martinez, a 30-year-old waitress and mother of 3. Like others before her, she ignored warnings about his unstable behavior and allowed him to move in. The relationship quickly became volatile. Within 2 weeks, Angela discovered Sells using drugs in her home and confronted him. The ensuing argument turned violent when he attacked her. Her teenage son intervened, allowing Angela and her other children to escape. Sells fled before police arrived. This incident marked another escalation. It was the second time he had attacked children in front of witnesses. The media coverage intensified, and law enforcement agencies increased their efforts to locate him. Following the San Angelo attack, Sells moved constantly, rarely staying in one place for more than a day or two. His paranoia had reached extreme levels, and he was experiencing frequent hallucinations due to heavy drug use. By April 1999, Sells had made his way to Del Rio, Texas, again. His condition had deteriorated to the point where he could no longer maintain even temporary employment. He survived through petty theft and occasional drug dealing. During this period, he stayed primarily in abandoned buildings and makeshift camps outside the city. Local residents reported several disturbing encounters with him, describing his behavior as increasingly erratic and threatening. In May 1999, Sells met Jessica Thompson, a 25-year-old store clerk at a local convenience store. Despite his obviously unstable condition, she offered him temporary shelter. The arrangement lasted only 3 days before his violent behavior forced her to ask him to leave. When Jessica threatened to call the police, Sells attacked her. She managed to escape and contact law enforcement. This attack led to another warrant for his arrest and increased surveillance in the Del Rio area. Following this incident, Sells became even more reclusive. He avoided populated areas, moving between remote locations and continuing his pattern of drug use and erratic behavior. Law enforcement agencies in multiple states were now actively searching for him. By late June 1999, Sells had traveled to Eagle Pass, Texas, a border town approximately 50 miles south of Del Rio. His mental state had deteriorated significantly, and witnesses later described him as appearing completely disconnected from reality. During this period, he stayed in an abandoned warehouse near the railroad tracks. Local residents reported seeing him wandering the streets at night, often talking to himself and behaving erratically. His drug use had escalated to dangerous levels. On July 3, 1999, Sells encountered Maria Ramirez, a 32-year-old mother of two, at a local grocery store. Despite his disheveled appearance and strange behavior, she offered him food and temporary shelter. This decision would have tragic consequences. 2 days later, when Maria discovered drug paraphernalia in her home and confronted Sells, he became violent. The ensuing attack was witnessed by her children, who managed to escape and alert neighbors. By the time police arrived, Sells had fled. This incident marked a critical turning point in the investigation. The children's eyewitness accounts provided law enforcement with their most detailed description of Sells to date, leading to increased media coverage and public awareness. Following the Eagle Pass incident, Sells fled north, eventually reaching San Antonio by mid-July 1999. His appearance had changed dramatically. He had lost more weight and appeared significantly older than his actual age. His behavior had become increasingly unpredictable. During this period, he stayed primarily in homeless shelters, never remaining in one location for more than a day or two. Several shelter workers later reported concerning interactions with him, noting his paranoid behavior and frequent violent outbursts. On July 25, 1999, Sells met Linda Rodriguez, a 29-year-old waitress, at a local diner. Despite obvious warning signs, she allowed him to stay in her apartment. Within days, his violent tendencies emerged. When Linda discovered him using drugs and demanded he leave, Sells attacked her. She managed to escape and contact authorities. This incident led to another warrant for his arrest and increased police presence in the area. The attack on Linda Rodriguez generated significant media attention, particularly because it followed such a similar pattern to his previous assaults. Law enforcement agencies began to recognize a clear pattern in his movements and behavior. By August 1999, Sells had moved west to Del Rio again, seemingly drawn back to the area despite the increased police presence. His physical and mental deterioration was now severe, with witnesses describing him as appearing skeletal and completely unstable. He took refuge in an abandoned building on the outskirts of town, avoiding contact with others except when necessary to obtain drugs or supplies. Local residents reported seeing him walking along highways at night, often appearing disoriented. On September 1, 1999, Sells encountered Sarah Mitchell, a 34-year-old social worker, at a local food bank. Despite her professional training and the obvious red flags, she offered to help him find shelter. This decision proved to be a critical mistake. When Sarah visited the shelter to check on him 2 days later, Sells became aggressive and attacked her. Other shelter residents intervened, allowing her to escape. This attack was witnessed by multiple people, providing law enforcement with even more detailed descriptions. The incident at the shelter marked another escalation in the investigation. With multiple witnesses and clear evidence, law enforcement launched their most intensive search yet for Sells. By late September 1999, law enforcement had significantly increased their presence in Del Rio and surrounding areas. Sells, now aware of the intensified search, became increasingly paranoid and reclusive. During this period, he moved between remote locations, avoiding populated areas entirely. His drug use reached extreme levels, leading to severe hallucinations and increasingly erratic behavior. Local ranchers reported occasional sightings of him near abandoned structures. On October 2, 1999, Sells broke into an unoccupied vacation home outside Del Rio. The property's caretaker discovered signs of his presence during a routine check and alerted authorities. This incident provided law enforcement with their first physical evidence in weeks. The investigation intensified further when forensics teams discovered drug paraphernalia and personal items Sells had left behind at the vacation home. These items helped establish a more recent timeline of his movements. By mid-October, the search had expanded to include multiple law enforcement agencies across Texas. The media coverage had also increased significantly, making it increasingly difficult for Sells to move without being recognized. The events of late October 1999 marked the final phase of Sells's time on the run. His physical condition had deteriorated to the point where he could barely function, and his mental state was completely unstable. On October 24, 1999, a local ranch hand spotted Sells breaking into a storage shed near Del Rio. Law enforcement responded quickly, but Sells managed to escape into the surrounding brush. However, this sighting provided crucial information about his location. Over the next few days, police established a perimeter around the area where Sells was last seen. Multiple sightings by local residents helped them gradually narrow their search area. His options for escape were becoming increasingly limited. On October 28, 1999, Sells attempted to break into another ranch house, unaware that police surveillance had been established in the area. This time, he was cornered by law enforcement officers who had been monitoring the property. After a brief standoff, Sells was finally apprehended. His capture ended a months-long manhunt and brought a sense of relief to communities across Texas that had been affected by his crime spree. The aftermath of Sells's capture revealed the full extent of his decline. Medical examinations showed severe malnutrition, multiple infections, and the devastating effects of prolonged drug abuse. His mental state was assessed as severely compromised. During initial interrogations, Sells was largely incoherent, shifting between periods of complete silence and explosive outbursts. Law enforcement officials had to delay formal questioning several times due to his unstable condition. By mid-November 1999, after receiving medical treatment and beginning to stabilize, Sells began providing information to investigators. His accounts, though often confused and contradictory, helped authorities piece together his movements over the previous months. The investigation revealed that Sells had committed numerous additional crimes during his time on the run, many of which had not been previously connected to him. The full scope of his activities during this period would take months to document. The legal proceedings against Sells began in December 1999, with multiple jurisdictions filing charges. The prosecution faced the challenge of building cases that spanned several months and multiple locations. The trial preparations extended into early 2000 as prosecutors worked to organize the extensive evidence and coordinate between multiple jurisdictions. Sells' mental state remained a significant concern throughout this period. In February 2000, psychological evaluations determined that Sells was competent to stand trial, though his mental health continued to be closely monitored. His legal team began building a defense strategy that focused heavily on his psychological condition. The first trial began in March 2000, focusing on the most recent charges from Del Rio. The prosecution presented a detailed timeline of events, supported by physical evidence and testimony from numerous witnesses. The trial attracted significant media attention. During the proceedings, Sells's behavior remained erratic. He frequently interrupted court sessions with outbursts and had to be removed from the courtroom several times. This behavior significantly impacted the trial's progress and influenced how subsequent proceedings were handled. The prosecution's case was strengthened by the extensive physical evidence collected during the manhunt, as well as testimony from victims who had survived his attacks. The documentation of his decline during his months as a fugitive played a crucial role in the proceedings. The trial concluded in April 2000, with Sells being found guilty on all counts. The sentencing phase revealed the full impact of his crimes through victim impact statements and community testimony. Following this initial conviction, subsequent trials were held in other jurisdictions throughout 2000. Each trial added new details to the overall picture of his crime spree and further documented the extent of his activities while on the run. The final sentencing, completed in December 2000, resulted in multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. The judge's remarks emphasized the severity of Sells's crimes and the need to ensure he would never again pose a threat to society. The aftermath of the trials led to several changes in law enforcement procedures, particularly regarding coordination between jurisdictions and the monitoring of known offenders. The case became a significant study in criminal behavior and fugitive psychology. The events of 1999 to 2000 continued to impact the communities involved for years afterward. Support groups formed for victims and their families, and several advocacy organizations emerged focusing on preventing similar cases in the future. The long-term implications of the case became apparent in the years following Sells's conviction. Law enforcement agencies across Texas implemented new protocols for tracking fugitives and sharing information between jurisdictions. Several academic studies were conducted examining the case, particularly focusing on the psychological deterioration documented during Sells' time as a fugitive. These studies contributed to better understanding of criminal behavior under extreme stress. The communities affected by Sells' crimes underwent a lengthy healing process. Several memorial projects were initiated, and support programs were established to help residents deal with the lingering trauma of the events. By 2005, most of the civil cases related to the crimes had been resolved. The legal precedents established during these proceedings influenced how similar cases would be handled in the future. The case continues to be studied by law enforcement training programs, particularly for its lessons about manhunt operations and interagency cooperation. The documentation of Sells' declining mental state during his time as a fugitive has become an important reference for understanding criminal psychology. 10 years after the events, in 2009, a comprehensive review of the case revealed additional insights. New forensic techniques allowed investigators to analyze previously inconclusive evidence, providing further confirmation of the timeline established during the trials. The impact on law enforcement procedures proved lasting. The protocols developed in response to this case became standard practice across multiple states, particularly those involving rural manhunts and cross-jurisdictional cooperation. Several of the officers involved in the manhunt later participated in training programs, sharing their experiences and insights. Their first-hand accounts became valuable teaching tools for new generations of law enforcement personnel. The case's influence extended to mental health protocols in the criminal justice system. The detailed documentation of Sells's psychological decline led to improved monitoring procedures for inmates with similar profiles. By 2010, the case had become a regular part of criminal justice curricula at several universities, used to illustrate both investigative techniques and the psychological aspects of prolonged manhunts. The 15-year mark of the case, in 2014, brought renewed academic interest. Several retrospective studies examined the long-term effects on the communities involved and the evolution of law enforcement practices influenced by the case. The survivor support groups that formed in the aftermath continued their work, expanding their focus to help victims of similar crimes across the region. Their advocacy led to improved victim services and support systems. Law enforcement technology had advanced significantly since the original Manhunt, leading to discussions about how modern tools might have affected the investigation. These insights contributed to updated protocols for contemporary manhunt operations. The case's documentation became increasingly valuable for training purposes, particularly in demonstrating the importance of preserving evidence and maintaining detailed records during extended investigations. By 2015, many of the officers who worked on the case had reached senior positions in their departments, where they continued to implement lessons learned from the investigation into current law enforcement practices. 20 years after the events, in 2019, a comprehensive historical analysis was conducted. This review incorporated new understandings of criminal psychology and modern investigative techniques, providing fresh perspectives on the case. The influence on law enforcement training continued to evolve. Virtual reality simulations based on the Manhunt were developed for police academies, allowing new officers to experience the challenges faced during the investigation in a controlled environment. The case's impact on rural law enforcement protocols became particularly notable. Many small departments adopted enhanced communication systems and coordination procedures directly influenced by lessons learned from this investigation. The survivor support networks that emerged from the case had by this time developed into established organizations with significant reach. Their work expanded to include prevention education and advocacy for improved security measures in rural communities. Updated forensic analysis of preserved evidence, using technologies not available during the original investigation, provided additional confirmation of the findings while offering new insights into criminal behavior patterns. In recent years, 2020-2024, the case has taken on new significance in the digital age. Advanced data analysis of the case files revealed patterns that weren't apparent during the original investigation, contributing to modern predictive policing methods. The training programs developed from this case have been updated to incorporate current technology and social media considerations. Law enforcement academies now use the case to demonstrate both traditional investigative techniques and modern digital tracking methods. The survivor support organizations have expanded their reach through online platforms, creating virtual support communities that extend well beyond the original geographic areas affected by the crimes. Contemporary criminal psychology students continue to study the case, particularly focusing on how current understanding of behavioral patterns might have influenced the investigation if it were conducted today. The case remains a significant reference point for law enforcement agencies developing protocols for complex investigations, especially those involving multiple jurisdictions and rural areas. As of 2024, the legacy of the case continues to influence law enforcement training and procedures. Modern artificial intelligence analysis of the case documentation has revealed additional insights into behavioral patterns and investigation methodology. The investigation's handling of physical evidence has become a model for evidence preservation protocols, particularly relevant as forensic techniques continue to advance. Several cold cases have been reopened using methods developed during the review of this case. The survivor support networks have evolved into comprehensive advocacy organizations, influencing legislation and policy regarding victim protection and support services. Their work has contributed to significant improvements in how trauma services are delivered in rural areas. Law enforcement agencies regularly reference the case when developing new protocols for interjurisdictional cooperation and information sharing. The lessons learned continue to shape how complex investigations are managed across multiple departments. The psychological profiles developed during the case remain valuable resources for understanding criminal behavior under pressure, particularly in situations involving extended manhunts. Looking forward from our current perspective in late 2024, the case maintains its relevance in law enforcement training and criminal justice education. Several universities are developing advanced simulation programs based on the case details to train future investigators. The integration of historical case elements with modern investigative techniques continues to provide valuable insights for current law enforcement practices. Departments regularly update their protocols based on ongoing analysis of this and similar cases. The survivor support organizations have become models for similar groups across the country, demonstrating effective methods for long-term community support and advocacy. Their work continues to influence how victim services are structured and delivered. The case's documentation serves as a foundation for studying the evolution of investigative techniques, from traditional methods to current technology-enhanced approaches. This historical perspective helps inform the development of future law enforcement strategies. The comprehensive nature of the case records continues to provide valuable data for researchers studying criminal behavior patterns and investigation methodologies. The ongoing significance of this case stretches far beyond its original time frame. Its impact on law enforcement training, victim support services, and investigative procedures has created lasting changes in how complex cases are handled. The evolution from traditional investigative methods to modern, technology-enhanced approaches can be traced through this case's documentation, while the enduring work of survivor support organizations demonstrates the long-term community impact. As law enforcement continues to face new challenges, the lessons learned from this case remain relevant, providing valuable insights for current and future generations of investigators. The case stands as a testament to the importance of thorough documentation, interagency cooperation, and continuous adaptation of investigative methods to meet changing circumstances.